Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to be here. So Kat alluded to it a little bit, but what I'm going to talk about today is a project that I run out of the U.S. Institute of Peace called the Justice and Security Dialogues Project in the Sahel and Maghreb, and I know there are a couple people here who are somewhat familiar with it from INL. And I was asked to talk a little bit about what we've learned about citizen and community security challenges or successes. So what I'm going to do is start by giving you an overview of the project. I'll try to be brief on that point, but it's a large project, so it might take a bit. And then to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've learned about it, and then finally to address the final question that Kat proposed, which was how applicable this kind of thing is more broadly. She said, I know that you're interested in getting very specific examples, so because this project covers 6 countries, it's going to be maybe more general than you'd like, but I'm very happy to answer more specific questions in the question period, if that's helpful. So very basically, the JSD, the Justice and Security Dialogue approach to building citizen security, is an approach which allows USIP to support locally driven, adaptive, and systemic justice and security reforms in complex environments. So that's very vague. I can get a little more concrete about what it is. So this is a project that USIP runs, you see there, in partnership with State Department INL, and then with local partners in each of the countries where we're working. This is active in 6 countries: Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria, and Tunisia. The project began in 2015, about October 2015, and currently runs through November 2019. So to give you a little more concrete idea of how it is that we try to improve citizen security, is that we begin with a series of inclusive community-driven dialogues. So there's one in each pilot site of the countries. And what we do in these dialogues is we try to bring together a really broad range of community actors. So, of course, representatives from the security services, representatives from local government, representatives from any kind of traditional or customary leadership, religious leadership, civil society, and really as many different sectors of the community that we're working in as we can identify a legitimate representative for. We then bring them together to take part in a process where they start to identify what are the most important security problems in our community. And that's from this citizen security perspective. So one of the questions we often ask is, what in your day-to-day life makes you feel safe or unsafe? When we get a nice big long list of that, which can span a huge range of kinds of problems, what we then do is ask them to prioritize that. And it does get very interesting there, as Kat alluded to, in that we often see a big division between what the security services will initially prioritize. So that would be sort of larger crimes, transnational crime, particularly in some of the countries where we're working, violent extremism. And when we began the project 3.5 years ago, we didn't really see a lot of those kinds of things on the list that came from the community members. That was much more along the lines of, again, some of the things Kat mentioned, so public lighting, cattle theft, break-ins, a lot about security on the roads, whether that was just because of traffic laws or poor conditions of the roads or vehicles, or because there's a lot of banditry that goes on along the roads. But it would also be very specific to the communities. So, for example, in Senegal, where we work outside Dakar, one of the major concerns that people had was sand theft. Which surprised me. I'd never heard of that, but apparently is a big issue. So what is happening there is that the government is trying to kind of extend the city of Dakar up the peninsula. To expand it, that takes a lot of concrete takes sand, and Gedjouai is a community that has a lot of sand. So people will come in, take a bunch of sand, truck it out of the city. The problem is then that this is eroding the beaches, which means that the water is getting into the community. They already have a huge flooding problem during the rainy season, and this becomes a huge threat to public health, to free movement of people, and really does fall under that kind of citizen security umbrella. That did not at all make it on the list of the security services in Gedjouai. So going through this exercise, they have to come to kind of an agreement on what those priorities are. And that not only gets kind of both sides to see what is the other side prioritizing, and particularly for the security services to see what is this community that I'm intended to be serving really afraid of or not afraid of. It also is really helpful in getting them to realize that there is a shared interest in the security of this community. So this is often the first time that they're having this kind of open conversation with security actors. And when there's that distance and the kind of legacy that Kat alluded to of, initially colonialism, then a lot of use of these security services to protect autocratic regimes or just to protect the elite or the government from the people, there's a very strong perception, often justified, sometimes not, that these security services are not interested in community safety. That, at a macro level has started to shift, but often at the ground level, perceptions are pretty far behind these big macro level changes. And we found that this is really helpful for aligning those interests, but then also getting people, as I said, to realize that they may be coming at it from different directions, but they are all really interested in this security at this level. What we then asked them to do is do a bit of analysis around these priority security issues. So this would maybe be the top 1, 2, or 3. When we started out, I think in almost every location where we were working, this was something to do with violent theft, particularly theft of livestock. It shifted a little because of the violent extremist threat. I think that's much more relevant to a lot of people these days in that region of the world. But thinking about, well, how does the problem happen? What is being done to address it? How is that working or not working, and why? And in the course of this conversation, a lot of what comes out is, of course, just a basic analysis, but also a better understanding of what efforts are being made. So in a lot of places, it really appears like the security services are not doing anything about these things. That may be the case. But in fact, in some of these places, there are a lot of constraints on what they can do. So for example, in one of the places that we work outside Ouagadougou, Saba, it's a commune of about 500 square kilometers with 26 villages spread across that. When we started there, they had about 30, between the national police and the gendarmerie, they had about 30 officers, and they had no dedicated means of transport. So the police had personal motorcycles, but there was no, dedicated police motorcycle or gendarmerie motorcycle, and they didn't actually have electricity in either of their barracks, so they couldn't charge their phones. And so, there had been this impression among the people in this area that, well, I call you and you're not coming because you're doing something else or you don't care, you're not trying, you're sitting there and collecting your salary. When in fact, and one of the reasons we went there is because we had a commissar and a commandant of the police and gendarmerie who were interested in doing better. They were both able then to demonstrate to the community, we are doing as much as we can with some pretty limited resources. So when you call us and we can't make it until the next day, it's probably because we really can't make it. Maybe there's no way to get across the 500 square kilometers. Maybe all 30 of these officers are already out on other kinds of duties. And that was really helpful in starting to change those kinds of perceptions, was understanding some of those limitations on all of the actors. The next step that we asked people to carry out is to actually start planning, and there you can see the locations of all of our community pilot sites, but is to start planning as a community, drawing on the resources that are available to us. What is it that we could do together to try and address these problems? And it's important to us that we ask them to consider this problem kind of at a level that they can influence and consider solutions in the terms of the resources that they have accessible to them. We find this to be important because we're very aware that these are countries with very limited resources to put towards security. And if we come in for 2, 3, 5 years, and through this process they start identifying, it would be great if we could have a whole fleet of motorcycles. That's great, but when we leave and those motorcycles break down, the community hasn't really made any progress towards a sustainable problem-solving process. And what we're really trying to do here is set up the relationships, a platform, and kind of the habit of coming together to solve these problems themselves, whether, hopefully, eventually, whether we're there or not. So they come up with these plans and then actually go out and implement these plans. These can be a whole range of things. It very much depends, what the security problems they identified are, what their resources are, and really the state of the relationship. So to give just kind of a broad spread, in some of the places where the relationship was really, really poor, what the community leaders felt was that, well, we can't really start with a very, very substantive kind of activity. We can't start as citizens by telling the police, you shouldn't be working here, you should be working here. The police, we can't start by inviting people into our station, they won't come. So in those cases, it was things like cleaning up cemeteries, playing soccer games, which on their own, have some value, but were intended to build towards something bigger. On the other hand, in some of the places where the relationships were already not quite as bad, what it ended up being at first was sometimes things like community members working with the police to help them figure out, well, where should we be deploying officers? Or in some cases, looking ahead, seeing, public holidays are coming up, and working with local businesses to get them to sponsor additional officers on a certain day. So it's a really broad range of kinds of activities that they'll carry out. And as I mentioned, the idea with all of this is that you can start with some relatively non-contentious security problems where there is that common interest and that consensus. So in this case, theft was a really good place to start because there were very few people in these communities, other than the thieves themselves, that had a problem with those kinds of things. Over time, what this does is build a relationship through these common interests, through these improved perceptions, through initially personal relationships that then develop into professional and more institutional relationships. And eventually there's enough of a base of trust, although I should say this does take time, that you can start to address some of the more contentious kinds of issues, maybe around police use of excessive force, which is not something they would have necessarily been open to at the beginning. But once they have this kind of relationship, they become more open to talking about those kinds of problems. And just to give you a very brief idea of how this plays out in the early stages, I think what we were surprised to see was that fairly quickly you do start to get some real impacts from this kind of thing. While the trust and relationship building takes much longer, by going at this through the kind of entry point of these concrete security challenges, you're able to have that impact very quickly. So for example, in Mali, we work around the Sogoniko bus station. This is in Commune 6 of Bamako. And this is a transport hub for Mali and really for a lot of West Africa. And it's also a major transit point for a lot of flows of illicit goods, so drugs, people, arms. And then the travelers, the amount of travelers there, and then the businesses are there, attract a lot of thieves, a lot of scam artists, petty crime and violence. And very early on in this process, what we saw was that citizens who had now formed relationships with some of the police officers were giving them tip-offs. So they would have information from someone that a shipment of drugs was coming in, and the officers were able to then seize that shipment of drugs. So that was the kind of thing that happened actually a lot more quickly than we expected it to. With these local pilots, we've been running them in the first phase for a couple of years, and over the year and a half, 2 years, we're able to collect some of these kinds of impacts, some of this evidence that when you do approach security from the citizen security perspective and in this more collaborative way, you have some very good results. What we were able to do then, working with our local partners, was to start talking to policymakers on the national level, to take this and go to them and say, you have these problems, you are really under-resourced in terms of security. This is what has been able to happen when you take this more collaborative approach, and to start to work with them to try and move policies, certain policies, and I'm being vague because they're a little bit different depending on the country, what the kind of target is, but to move those to a more to alter those so that they're more supportive and more enabling of this kind of security provision. And I can give again one example there. I'll stick with Mali. So we had the first year and a half. We had the gendarmerie quite involved in this process, and out of that, the head of the gendarmerie in Mali came to us and said, I really like the way this project is going. I'm interested in using this more broadly. Could you provide us the technical support to set up this initiative in 3 additional places around Bamako so that we can test this out, we can see how we might be able to sponsor this kind of process for potentially larger application. That's been ongoing. The other major initiative in Mali is that we spend a lot of time in addition to running the local pilot, talking to different organizations who were doing similar kinds of things, who had this similar sort of citizen security focus. And through these consultations and kind of bringing those voices a bit more together, we're put in the position that we were asked by the, sorry, I have the French in my head, the Commissar for, Security Sector Reform. They have a sort of national security sector reform committee. And what they are interested in doing is working with all of the different security services to come up with a more comprehensive and sort of harmonized approach to community policing in Mali. So what we're doing with our partners in Mali is to, again, provide them kind of the technical support in setting up this process, how it can be inclusive, how it can bring in not only security actors, but also community actors, civil society, and the other big thing in Mali in particular that we've been trying to kind of create a structure to do is really incorporate leaders from the different regions of Mali, because I don't know how many of you are familiar with the conflict, but doing something that was very heavily Bamako-based would not be effective or well-received, really. And then finally, and so we have similar-ish kinds of initiatives in the other countries as well. And then finally, at the regional level, what we try to do is to bring together key decision makers from each of these countries, whether that's in civil society or in the security services, in regional events that are really targeted at helping them tackle difficult problems in operationalizing this kind of approach to security. And I'll mention a little bit more about that later. But what you do see a lot is some good intentions, some decent policies, and then it can fall down in the kind of putting it into practice. And I'll give you a few specific examples of some of the things that the JSC participants, so the people that make up that dialogue group, were able to accomplish once we'd kind of supported them to create this platform. So in Nigeria, you'll see there we work in Jos North, in Plateau State, in the Middle Belt. One of the areas of Jos North that our project covered, about 6 months before we started there, a group of angry youths had burned down a police station and essentially driven those police out of that area of the city. Police, we were told when we went there, wouldn't cross this area in uniform because they were afraid. And what the residents of that neighborhood saw over that 6 months, though, was that crime really did increase. So when we went in there, it was at a point where the police had always wanted to go back in there. That was their mandate. They were supposed to be there, but they felt they couldn't be. And the citizens had somewhat come around to the idea that, we may not have liked them, we may have burned down their station, but they actually are useful to us. So what was able to happen just by carefully bringing together certain community leaders in a kind of supported series of conversations was that the police and the community leaders were able to reach an agreement whereby the police said, if you can demonstrate to us that you really want us to come back and that you will be standing behind us and look out for us, then we're willing to go back in there. And what that gesture ended up being was a lot more dramatic than we had expected, was a local councilwoman donated a plot of land and members of the community donated labor and time and materials to build actually a new police station. We were told, but I actually can't back this up, that some of the people that worked on rebuilding the police station were the same people that had burned down the previous police station. But like I said, I have no real way of verifying that. A second example was in Burkina Faso. So as I mentioned, one of the problems there was just very, very few officers. So it's not really realistic that they could patrol this territory in a kind of meaningful way. What they in the community worked out as a way that community members could kind of supplement those security services was that community members formed community watch cells. So I'm sure you're all familiar with them. We have them in the US, they're everywhere. So there's these groups of citizens who are well connected, well informed, who know the community really well, and really just patrol high crime areas, keep their ear out. They're known as resource people, that if you have some information but you don't want to go to the police, whether you don't feel comfortable or you don't want to be kind of known as an informer, you can go to these people and they can serve as an intermediary. So there are a number of these operating in that commune. One of the more dramatic results of that early on was that some of these community members had seen someone new to the community who had gone to a number of different landlords looking to rent empty buildings at a very high price. Oh, sorry, 2 minutes. Well, then I think I'll just stick to the program description, and you guys can ask questions about lessons in that. I'll just finish this up very quickly. So gone house to house, wanted to rent empty buildings at a very high price, had gone to the mosque but wasn't praying. They got suspicious. They kind of stopped him in the market, asked him what he was doing. They felt like he was very suspicious. They thought, well, it's not we can't really detain this person. They called the police. Unfortunately, the police said we can't really get there for a while. So they held him for a while. When the police got there, eventually, they found he had a backpack full of grenades. And as they kind of followed that thread, found that he was in the process of planning some kind of attack of the kind that you do hear about in Burkina Faso. Yeah, I can leave it there and leave the lessons for the question and answer. Okay, great. Thank you.